Hi, everyone. I'm here with my friend Al-FADI, and we've just recorded a lot of shows about arguments for Islam. And I was with you on a show years ago that we recorded over Skype, but I've never seen your testimony. And I know that you're a former Muslim, that you grew up in Saudi Arabia. But beyond that, I don't really know much. So I figure this would be a great time to learn. So why don't you start by telling us what your life was like in Saudi Arabia growing up?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, brother. It's always a privilege and an honor to serve the Lord with you. I am always thankful for the material you produce all the time for the sake of my people to find the truth. And thank you so much for your hard labor. You're absolutely right. I am a former Muslim from Saudi. That's where I was born and raised. And as you know, brother, Saudi Arabia really has a special place when it comes to Islam, simply because it's the birthplace of Islam. And I just happened to be born, basically, and raised in a town near Mecca. So there was this bond not only to Islam and its origin, but also my close proximity to Mecca. And as you know, Islam is a religion of works. Therefore, more good deeds you do, more chances you have in order for you to earn your way to heaven. And being near Mecca, that means that I can always go and do the rituals and the things that are required of me, simply even praying in Mecca most of the time for that purpose. As I was basically growing up, I began to study more and more Islam at a deeper level. Now, not all Muslims, by the way, you're going to meet, even from Saudi, are that religious. I want to be fair. Not all of them are that devout. But the tendency for people in Saudi to be devout, if you wish, is much higher than you find it in other areas outside of Saudi Arabia, simply because Islam is really emphasized in there, not only at the school level, not only at the college level, but also it is emphasized by the way of life in there and the Sharia law application and so many aspects basically of life in there. So this is how I was raised basically, and that was the environment I grew up in.
And obviously something changed at some point. So, and you're here. So I know, even without you telling me, that a couple of things changed. So what changed first? Did you leave Saudi Arabia first, or did you start doubting Islam while in Saudi Arabia?
Well, actually, right before I left to come to the West for my graduate education, I finished my college back in Saudi with the engineering degree. But the thing is this. Almost before that happened, during my high school years, I was fascinated with the idea of jihad to the point that I was even seriously considering going to Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And it was people like Osama bin Laden who left, and many of the young Saudi men left also as well. And therefore, I was fascinated with this idea of not just fighting, but dying as a martyr for all these rewards that I was reading about when it comes to the rewards for martyrdom. But by the grace of God, I was basically prevented from doing so, and I finished my college. And then I came to the West, and as you know, Muslims are raised to believe that all of the Western Hemisphere basically is Christian, maybe with the exception to few that might be Jews, but technically speaking, you are born into a religion called Christianity. And this religion happened to be the one right before Islam. Therefore, it's canceled, it's obsolete. But at the same time, Christians who live in the West, they're immoral. Why? Because their Bible has been corrupted, and evidenced by the fact that they have nightclubs, have bars, and you watch movies and you assume that this is the culture at large as a result of this. So I came to the West with that mindset. But it's almost like within the first month, I, believe it or not, I just struggled with the use of idioms, and that led me into basically getting connected through some of the campus ministries with a family that was a born-again believer. That was the first time I've ever heard of such a thing when we were having this spiritual discussions. And it was through that process that my mind began to shift into basically willingness and also just the desire to learn more about this Christianity that I knew nothing about. Initially, my intent was to convert people to Islam. I didn't really want to learn about it for the sake of leaving Islam, but that's how the process began.
Wait, so you got involved with Christians because you were trying to work on your English speaking abilities?
My English, exactly.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So, how did you come to doubt Islam? Because most Christians that you would ever run into generally know very little about Islam. So I doubt they would have been presenting criticisms of Islam. So how did you come to doubt Islam?
That is true. It's after a few months of my encounter with this family, I ended up changing my major. I moved from that place where I was to another place. And I severed my relationship with the family, never bothered to reconnect with them. Graduated, got a job offer. And it was years later I met more people, and specifically another family. And it was when I began to engage them in discussions about my faith, Islam. In other words, I was inviting them to accept Islam. That's when they began to push back gently, asking me for proof when I said the Bible is corrupt. Asking me for proof when I made claims that Jesus wasn't crucified, and at the same time sharing back with me what does the Bible say, what other evidence there are available, and asking me also to reason about certain facts and things of that nature. In other words, they were really countering my arguments with ways to force me to examine and think about the claims that I'm making. And in this case, I began to discover slowly and gradually that I'm making really big claims that I cannot back up. And it was through this process, that was a long process. It took almost 12 years for it because I was definitely an apologetic at heart. I had this zeal for Islam. And of course, I wanted to prove that I was right. But of course, by God's grace, through this pushback, I began to slowly to doubt Islam until I got to a point where I definitely discovered that either I'm living a big lie or I know nothing about Islam, at least the way I learned it. And that was the turning point, basically.
And so what happened after that?
I got invited to go to a church a couple of times, and I refused to do so, for obvious reasons. Muslims, of course, don't like to go to churches anyway. And one of it is they're afraid that they'll be seen by others. Sometimes they think God is going to punish them, and so on and so forth. I spent about a year and a half, give or take, basically in, I call it spiritual vacation. I wasn't fasting, I wasn't praying, I wasn't doing anything. So I felt guilty, Remember, I'm religious most of my life. You don't do any of these rituals, all of a sudden you feel like there's something missing here. You're wired to be religious, but at the same time, I felt also a heavy burden almost like lifted off my shoulder. So I was really in this middle stage. Do I really go back to being religious, or why am I feeling relieved at least? And it was during that phase when I agreed finally to go to that church. And when I attended the church, I began to hear the gospel being preached from the Gospel of John, from the pulpit. And all of a sudden, the things that I heard from that very first family 12 years earlier, and the other family, and others in between, somehow began to make more sense. Mm-hmm. The story almost began to make sense, perfect sense, actually. All of that, of course, led me to begin to question myself at a deeper level. Obviously, the Holy Spirit was convicting me already. And as a result of this, really, I felt like at some point, I'm going to have to make a decision. And then September 11 happened at the same time. And obviously, being a devout Muslim, I understood perfectly why these hijackers did what they did, of course. It's their ticket to heaven. That's the way they were thinking about it. At some point in my life, I wanted to die as a martyr. But the devastation of that act was being laid out before my eyes. And I began to see what I myself could have done as well years earlier to others, innocent people, innocent lives. And I began to really ask myself, why would God allow for things like this to happen for the purpose of few just to go to heaven? If he is really a God that I thought to be the God of peace, and my religion is a religion of peace, And to top that, that very weekend, I attended the same church, and they preached from the Gospel of Matthew about loving your enemies and praying for those who persecuted you. And that was a very powerful passage, because I reminded myself that if the God of the Bible is the God of the Quran, then something drastically happened to this God, that he changed his mind about loving your enemies 600 years before the coming of Muhammad, and all of a sudden now it is a command to hate and fight them.
We have to back up a second because I'm a little confused. Because on the one hand, you seem like you understand that Islam promotes jihad and martyrdom. But on the other hand, you are saying that Islam is a religion of peace. So is it something like the jihad is right because you're ultimately striving for peace and the good of the Islamic community, or something? Like, I can imagine if you're the fighting in Afghanistan, that
right.
These are Russian invaders, and so you're martyring
right.
yourself to stop the invaders or something like that.
No, that's a very good question. Before I reached that point of confusion, of course, certainly I would look at Islam as a religion of peace from a different perspective. Religion of peace in terms of spreading Islam, and that will be the only way to enforce peace. But then when I began to doubt Islam, I was touched now by what I've seen, and that really was the struggle that I faced. Reminding myself now, I used to think to do things like this, but at the same time, also the opposite side of that belief is that also it's a religion of peace. So how can this be peace? Mm-hmm. Because now I'm witnessing it by myself. And of course, that was a major event, as you know, globally. And that was a turning point, of course, in terms of people understanding about Islam and its teaching in relationship to jihad. And I've already been heard hearing the gospel, and obviously the Holy Spirit was doing his work already and convicting me. So it's the softness inside of me that allow me to, for the first time, to begin to examine things that in the past I accepted, but now it looked totally different to me.
And so what was the sort of last straw?
The last straw was, certainly it was very important for me to hear that passage being preached. I continued to come to that church for probably another 2 months or so, but a couple of times during those services, they would call people to the altar, of course, and if they want to accept Christ. I almost felt one time tempted to do this. I didn't know what was forcing me to think that way, but I kept denying my internal, basically, desires to follow along. But it came to a point where I really wasn't able at all to keep resisting. In fact, it was coupled also by seeing some sort of a dream. Typically people, especially Muslim people, are afraid of the idea of death for two reasons. Death means there is a possibility of punishment in the grave. But most importantly, you don't know really if you're going to end up making it to heaven or not. I mean, you still want to keep doing your good deeds. And the dream that I was getting actually was strange, that I died, and I'm standing before the throne of God, and he's asking me one question: why have you rejected my son? And that was a question I didn't know the answer to, yet at the same time I was already attending the church, and I'm hearing about the son already, and I've seen people accepting the son. And when I've seen this dream a couple of times happening almost within the span of these 2 months, it really terrified me. It's almost like I began to think about death. What's going to happen now if I truly die? What is basically the right path? Is it Islam, or is it what I'm hearing? And it's just by the grace of God that I finally came to my senses, and I realized that I must make that decision to follow Christ. And it wasn't an easy decision, of course, but there we are.
And so what happened afterwards?
Of course, there is always a cost that comes with this. I lost a lot of things almost immediately. And I have to admit, the first thing that came to my mind is that, did I make the wrong decision? And am I being punished by Allah as a result of this? And it goes to show, by the way, the importance of having the right people surround you and disciplers. Because of that, the people around me who are believers began to explain to me that this is spiritual warfare. God is not punishing you for coming to him, But God could be allowing these things to happen to you because maybe you have issues in the heart that He's working on. Maybe you have pride. Maybe He's preparing you for something big, a ministry or something of that sort. But don't look at it as if He's punishing you. He cannot punish you for coming to Him. He is. They began to show me passages that heaven is rejoicing that actually, as a sinner, you accepted basically Christ. So through this process, I began to it started to make sense to me that indeed, yes, there are things inside of me that began to change, things that I used to desire. Somehow I began to distance myself from material and stuff that I had affinity for, and I began to learn to be humble. And years later, of course, I look back and I am thankful now for the process that the Lord put me through.
Now, you could have just spent the rest of your life working your job, living quietly, and eventually died like that. But you've decided to focus on ministry and reaching Muslims. Why'd you take things in that direction?
Well, certainly it's God's calling, obviously. It wasn't just me trying to do something on my own. But here's the interesting thing. I remember the first maybe a few weeks after I became a believer, I was asking God, why did you make me a Muslim all of these years, denying me to know you since day one? Of course, little that I knew that the Lord actually had a ministry for me, and all of these years are not a waste because of my upbringing as a Muslim from Saudi Arabia, learning the Quran, learning tafsir, learning all the traditions that basically the Prophet taught and his biography, and almost learning it from the top-notch Islamist, gave me that authority when the day came for me to step into ministry. And of course, I looked at it as, since I know the truth now, I owe it to my people to let them know about this truth. And it's amazing how God began to surround me by godly men and women who began to serve me, began to disciple me, began to work on me. Our dear brother Sam Shamoun was one of them. And watching sometimes your videos with him and others that were other parts of my discipleship process. And of course, the Lord brought me into contacts with others where media door opened up for me, and I began to see the significance really of utilizing media to the glory of God if we use it wisely. Because I cannot multiply myself, you cannot multiply yourself, but the message could be spread to millions upon millions of Muslims. And that's really how I began to get involved with ministry that grew from just one-on-one to teaching at Sunday schools to teaching seminars, and all of a sudden get involved with satellite TV, and now my own, of course, website, videos, radio show, and the likes, basically.
One last question. You mentioned a situation where you saw the 9/11 attacks and decided to rethink things more carefully. I know there are lots of Muslims in the world today who are in that situation because they've seen a lot more than just 9/11. They're seeing what people are doing in the name of Allah around the world. Even right now during Ramadan, they're seeing the constant bombings, the suicide attacks, and so on. And many of them still believe in Islam, but this can become a time of reflection for them, time to think to themselves, is this religion true? Is all of this based on Islam, and is Islam true? And for those Muslims who might be ready to think about this for themselves for the first time, instead of just believing what's been passed down to them, what would you say to them?
What I would say is this. They are certainly fortunate today because in my days we didn't have Google, we didn't have internet, at least as powerful as we have today. Things have developed ever since. Of course, Google came into the equation later in my search, of course. They have access to many, basically, resources online at the privacy of their own home and places. I encourage them to go and examine all evidence available related not only just to Christ and the Bible, but also examine the falsehood, I should say, and the teachings of Islam in contrast to the teaching of the Bible and Christ, and ask themselves this question: what they are witnessing firsthand right now, whether at least themselves, their immediate family, friends, or maybe just what they're watching globally taking place, unfolding right before our eyes, does that make sense? That a religion that everyone think is a religion of peace would cause such chaos globally, and since September 11, this chaos continues to intensify to where we are today. Almost every region in the world has been impacted by it. Can truly the God who revealed Islam to be the religion of peace be the same God who is also causing all of this chaos? You see, you cannot pick and choose what the Quran teaches or what the Prophet teaches, because ISIS can justify their actions just like people who wants to claim that Islam is a religion of peace can justify their actions. So one side has to be right and one side has to be wrong. And the fact that you have contradictions from within, this should cause them to examine Islam at a deeper level, utilizing all of these resources that are available for them, which I did not have in my days.
Well, thank you, brother. And to everyone out there who would like to learn more, you can look at the links in the description box. That'll take you to Al-Fadi's YouTube channel, to many more videos by him, and to more details about his background and story. And look forward to hearing much more from you in the future.